The Ghost Train by L.E. Jenkins. Charlie stood at the edge of the derelict platform, peering down the dark tunnel. Held in his hands was a red wool scarf he had often wore in winter. The tunnel was quiet, save for the soft sound of dripping water and the distant cry of cicadas. Moss grew on the crumbling cement walls. Behind Charlie was a mural of an astronaut whose arms and legs seemed a little too long to be human. The subway had been unsafe for several decades, yet Charlie found himself standing there, waiting. He only had an inkling of why he was there. The abandoned subway was the subject of urban myth, the ghost train. There were many versions of the tale. They often involved witches, axe murders, fairies, or sometimes a combination of the three. However, all variations shared the same elements. At 4 a.m., the train would pull up to the station. It would stay exactly for 1 minute, and then it would leave. Where it went, no one knew. Charlie was waiting for the ghost train. He didn't have a reason for it, but he also didn't have a reason not to. His life had gone all to hell, and although he could start the process of picking it up again, he didn't want to. It wouldn't be the same, and he'd have to go and face the shame of what he did in the mirror every day. Earlier that night, he unwittingly destroyed 6 papyrus scrolls in the museum's archives. They were worth millions, maybe even billions, but it wasn't the money that bothered Charlie. Recently discovered, still untranslated, the papyri were thought to be at least 6,000 years old, and Charlie had destroyed them with nothing more than spilt water. Any information, any secrets they held, were now lost. He reported his accident, filled out all the paperwork with shaking hands. Then Charlie went home to wait for the inevitable firing. He tried to not think about it. He tried to eat his dinner. But at some point, he found himself grabbing his scarf as he headed to the abandoned subway station. There had been logic to it at the time, but Charlie had forgotten it. He didn't expect anything to happen, yet he half hoped something would. Something whose significance would make the destroyed papyri look like nothing at all. Something to make him not think about it. Charlie pulled his phone out of his pocket and checked the time. It was 3:59 a.m. Soon it would be 4 a.m. A light appeared in the tunnel, and its appearance followed by the steady beat of wheels on rusted tracks. Charlie stood there, gaping at the light as it grew larger and closer, revealing the gleaming metal of the train's exterior. It didn't look like how he had imagined it. The train had a rounded modern look as it pulled up to the station. Charlie could see that the inside was clean, well-lit interior, populated with not ghostly skeletons, but with normal human passengers. The kind you would see on any train in the city. For a moment, just a moment, Charlie didn't think of the papyri. The door to one of the train cars slid open, and Charlie wandered onto the train. He was only a few steps onto the train when the door slid shut behind him. The train lurched forward into motion. Charlie grabbed onto one of the handrails and wondered if he should worry about being locked in a train whose destination was unknown. And then he remembered the papyri. He decided that he would rather not leave the train car. Charlie surveyed his surroundings. He wasn't alone. There were 4 other people on the train car. Sitting closest to him was a woman wearing a floral dress. She had had her hair pulled back tight into a low bun. Charlie could see a nasty bruise on the right side of her forehead, just underneath the hairline. A few shopping bags were on the seat beside her, as if she was just out running errands. Her hands were folded on her lap as she stared at the darkness outside the window. Further down the aisle stood another woman. She had one hand loosely gripping the handrail. Her hair was dyed a neon orange and was shaved into an undercut. She wore a white tank top with the image of a goat's head printed on the front. There was a large burgundy stain on the back of the tank top. A few seats away from the orange-haired woman sat a bald man wearing a bellhop's uniform. He sat so still that if Charlie walked into a store, he could have mistaken the man for a mannequin. At the other end of the train car, there was someone curled up on one of the seats, buried under a mound of coats, sleeping. They were likely homeless. Charlie decided to sit down and began to walk down the aisle as he passed the brunette woman. She turned towards him and spoke. "Excuse me, does this train go to Queen's Park?" Charlie stopped for a moment and stared at her, frowning. He didn't know Queen's Park. The woman stared back expectantly. Charlie shrugged. "I don't know, sorry." He glanced at the other passenger. "Maybe someone else knows." The brunette woman sighed. "They don't." The orange-haired woman scoffed loudly. Charlie turned to see she was grinning madly at them, her fingers tightening around the handrail. "She didn't ask us a thing," the orange-haired woman said. The brunette woman sniffed. "Does this train go to Queen's Park?" Her voice was flat as she spoke, as if the question was more of a statement. "I don't know," the orange-haired woman answered, her grin growing wider. "I bet if you ask someone else, they will know." The brunette woman glared at the orange-haired woman and opened her mouth. "Don't you spout some bullshit about there being a way anyone else knows. We both know you didn't bother to find out," the orange-haired woman said before the brunette woman could speak. Charlie waited for the exchange to end. He felt like he had somehow gotten between two dogs fighting over a bone. He wanted to sit down, but was afraid that someone might snap at him if he did. The orange-haired woman turned to the bellhop. "Hey, you, do you know if this train goes to Queen's Park?" The bellhop shook his head. The brunette woman sniffed again. "I knew no one knew." "Bullshit. Besides, there's still one person left to ask," the orange-haired woman said as she began to march down the aisle towards the person sleeping under the pile of coats. "Enough," the brunette woman said, her voice growing louder. "I don't want your help." Charlie finally plucked up the courage to sit down. He slunk past the brunette woman, sitting down in a seat between the bellhop and the sleeping person. The orange-haired woman stopped. "Why is that?" she asked. The brunette woman paused, then muttered, "I don't bother with people like you." Charlie began to fidget with his scarf's tassels again. The orange-haired woman laughed. "You can't know what I'm like. You can't know what they're like," she said, pointing to the sleeping person. "You can't know unless you ask." She started to walk towards the sleeping person again. The brunette woman glared at her, but said nothing. The orange-haired woman stopped a couple feet away from the sleeping person. "Excuse me," she shouted. The person didn't stir. The orange-haired woman slowly reached out and poked the person's shoulder. The person didn't stir. One of the coats began to slide off them. The orange-haired woman stood there, waiting for the coat to fall away. Charlie diverted his gaze to the window, trying to separate himself from the scene unfolding, trying not to think about "Fuck!" Charlie jumped and looked over to see the orange-haired woman had stumbled back and onto the train floor. She was staring at the sleeping person with wide eyes. Charlie followed her gaze, then froze, dropping his scarf onto the ground. The sleeping person was not sleeping at all. They were dead. But they weren't just dead, they were mummified. Their skin was drawn taut across their bones, and their eyes had melted away to leave empty sockets. Charlie remembered where he was, the ghost train. He should not have expected anything normal. Something began to bubble up in his throat. Charlie had swallowed to stop it from pouring out. He leaned forward and picked up his scarf. The orange-haired woman dug into her pocket and pulled out a cell phone, her hands shaking. "Fuck," she repeated. "Does anyone have service?" "Heavens, no. I don't carry those things. They cause cancer," the brunette woman answered, her eyes fixed upon the corpse. Charlie looked at his own phone and found that it had no service either. No, he said. He wondered if the others knew where they were. The bellhop shook his head and got up, approaching the corpse. He bent down, picking up the coat and draping it back over the corpse, covering it back up. The brunette woman screamed and tried to leap back, but the person-like thing grabbed onto her wrist. The brunette woman screamed and tried to yank her hand back, dropping her bag in the process. Canned goods rolled across the floor, and Charlie just stood there, staring at it in helpless horror. Was there anything he could do? Was there anything he should do? They were already dead, weren't they? What else could be done? The thing started to reach towards the woman's face with its own hand. The bellhop stared at the unfolding scene, his face placid. The brunette woman kept screaming, and then a roar joined the brunette woman's screams. The orange-haired woman sprinted past Charlie and towards the thing. The thing stopped, jerking its head towards the orange-haired woman. Its perpetually smiling face watched as she rushed towards it, bringing her body low as she crashed into its knees. It didn't move. The thing just stood there. It turned its attention back to the brunette woman, who was still screaming. The orange-haired woman grabbed onto its knees and pressed all her weight into them, grunting loudly. The thing didn't seem to notice. It began to move its hands again, and this time its fingers made contact with the brunette woman's face. The brunette woman stopped screaming. Her body began to grow thin. Her skin became brittle and dry. She went limp. Charlie stood there, his heart beat thundering in his ears. He wanted to do something. He did nothing. The orange-haired woman kept trying to knock the thing over. She kept failing. She would be next. And then the thing would go after Charlie. They would all wind up as mummies on the ghost train. Despite being dead, Charlie still very much wanted to live. He began to force himself into action. At first his movements felt sluggish, and the air seemed to weigh down his limbs, but Charlie kept pressing forward. Finally, he entered the stone train car. The orange-haired woman was still trying to knock the thing over. As Charlie ran past her, he grabbed the back of her shirt and yanked her towards him and away from the thing. He was pretty sure she didn't want to die either. The orange-haired woman yelled and started to go back to trying to knock the thing over, but then stopped, her eyes drifting towards the brunette woman, quickly mummifying corpse. Before the moment had even passed, the orange-haired woman turned away from the thing and began running after Charlie towards the next train car. And all the while, the bellhop watched, his eyes unblinking. Charlie flung the door open, welcoming the warm blast of damp air. Then he yanked the door open and fled into the next car, the orange-haired woman on his heels. The bellhop followed them, walking slowly. The two of them almost fell into the next train car, their feet hitting the metal floor with a hollow thunk. Pink neon lights illuminated their way. The orange-haired woman stopped running and spinned around and grabbed the door to slam it, stopping when she realized that the bellhop was still in the next car. "Run!" she screamed. The bellhop did not run. He kept walking. It was a couple of seconds before he stepped into the next train car. As he did so, the thing dropped the brunette woman's corpse onto the ground and began pivoting towards them. A ragged gash split the drawn smile on its face. The orange-haired woman slammed the door shut as soon as the bellhop was through. "What the fuck was that?" she hissed. Charlie shrugged, trying his best to stop shaking. "Don't know," he said. The bellhop said nothing. Charlie frowned at the bellhop. He looked normal enough, but the calm way he seemed to react to everything was beginning to make Charlie more nervous than ever. It didn't help that when the orange-haired woman asked if they were dead, the bellhop was the one to answer yes. How could the bellhop know? Charlie didn't remember dying, and no one else seemed to remember either. The orange-haired woman began marching to the other end of the car. "Come on," she said, motioning for them to follow. Charlie blinked, shaking the strangeness out of it all from his head. The matter of the bellhop could wait. For now, they had to put as much distance between the thing as possible. He jogged after the orange-haired woman, and the bellhop followed at his own pace. They traveled through almost a dozen train cars without incident and without a word. The train cars varied wildly from one to the next. They looked like something Charlie would find at a normal subway station. Others were made of strange materials and constructed in strange styles. Occasionally they would come across a mummified corpse, and all three of them rushed past it wordlessly, afraid that acknowledging the corpse would summon the thing with the drawn-on face. When they entered the train car with domed windows and dining table set for a meal, the orange-haired woman stopped suddenly. She raised her hand up to motion for them to stop as well. Then she turned around, peering at the door that Charlie had just closed behind them. She stood there for several seconds, before taking a few steps back and sighing. "We're safe," she said. Charlie thought about that statement and glanced at the bellhop. He wasn't sure if it was true or not. Charlie shrugged and opened his mouth to ask the bellhop if he thought it was safe, but was interrupted. "You two, table, now." The orange-haired woman turned and looked at them and pointed at the dinner table. "We need to clear something up," she said. Charlie shut his mouth and slid into one of the nearest seats. His elbow nudged a silver fork, and it fell to the ground. He was about to move to pick it up when the bellhop sat right beside him. Charlie gulped and clutched his scarf, deciding that no one was going to mind if a fork was on the ground. The orange-haired woman sat in the seat across from them, briefly glancing at the silverware before her. Then, in one swift motion, she swept it aside, letting it all clatter to the ground, as drinking glasses shattered in thousands of shards. "I have questions, and you two have answers." Charlie shook his head. "I really don't. I just got on the train at the abandoned station." The orange-haired woman narrowed her eyes and glanced at the bellhop, who said nothing. "Then why'd you call it the fucking ghost train?" she asked. Charlie shrugged. "That's just what people called it. I'm not the first one to see it." The orange-haired woman sighed and leaned back, frowning as she thought for a moment. "Okay," she eventually said, then leaned forward, pointing her finger at the bellhop. "What makes you say we're dead?" The bellhop stared at her finger for a few seconds, then looked up to meet her gaze. He said nothing, but held out his wrist. He put 2 fingers against it as if he was checking for a pulse. Both Charlie and the orange-haired woman frowned as he did this, and put fingers on their own wrists. Charlie felt the steady throb of blood flowing through his veins. He seemed too alive to be dead. By the orange-haired woman's deepened frown, Charlie guessed that she was feeling a pulse too. The bellhop shook his head and held out his wrist again, slowly reaching to grab the orange-haired woman's hand. She jumped as his fingers touched her wrist, her eyes widening as he slowly pulled her hand towards him, placing her fingers on his wrist. She stared at him in wide-eyed confusion. Then she pulled her hand away. "The fuck?" she whispered, almost cradling her hand, her eyes fixed on the bellhop. The bellhop turned towards Charlie, holding his wrist out to him. Charlie gulped and decided not to wait for the bellhop to grab his hand. Instead, Charlie reached out, placing his fingers on the bellhop's wrist to take the pulse. But as he did so, he had to stop himself from shuddering. The bellhop's skin felt ice cold, and as Charlie held his fingers on the bellhop's wrist, he realized he couldn't feel anything moving. There was no pulse, no warmth, nothing beneath the skin, just a frigid stillness. Charlie drew his hand back from the bellhop's wrist and wrapped his scarf around it, turning his attention to the cutlery on the floor. Charlie had a pulse. The orange-haired woman had a pulse. The bellhop did not. Charlie gulped again and forced himself to look back at the bellhop. "Am I dead?" Charlie asked. The bellhop nodded. "Why is my heart beating?" The bellhop tapped his own head. Charlie frowned. He wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean. "Are you human?" the orange-haired woman asked. Charlie's eyes widened at that question, staring at the bellhop, expressionless face. The bellhop turned his head towards her and shrugged. Charlie leapt to his feet, scrambling away from the table, and the image of that thing that was drawn on that face flashed through his mind. The bellhop couldn't be human. He had to get away, put many train cars as possible between him and the bellhop. Charlie was about to yell at the orange-haired woman to run when she made a shushing sound and rolled her eyes. "Calm down," she said. "Plenty of things aren't human." I'm not going to take my chances," Charlie said, his voice shaking. "Well, fuck you too, I guess." The orange-haired woman waved her hand as if dismissing Charlie. "He didn't choose to be." She looked at the bellhop, who just shrugged again. "Not human?" Charlie stared at her in horror. So they were alive, on some supernatural train headed to God knows where, facing monsters that mimic humans and wanted to make them more dead than they already are. And the orange-haired woman wanted to sit down and have a conversation with one. He could kill us. Just like that thing," Charlie sputtered, waving his hands back towards the other way they came. The orange-haired woman rolled her eyes. "So, you could kill me too. How do I know you're not going to strangle me?" "What? That makes no sense. Why the hell would I do that?" The orange-haired woman leaned back. "I don't know. I'm not you. But humans kill other humans all the fucking time. Why should I take my chances with one?" Charlie opened his mouth to say she was being reckless, that the safe course of action was to stick together and be as far away as possible from the bellhop. But the argument fell apart before it could even leave his lips. The bellhop had done nothing to indicate that he was going to kill them, and there wasn't any reason for him to. The orange-haired woman was right in that aspect, but wasn't it better to be safe than sorry? "What if you're wrong?" Charlie asked after a long pause. The orange-haired woman shrugged. "I'll deal with it. I'm not going to run away because I don't understand what the fuck's going on. I'm not a stupid coward." Charlie glared at her. He'd accept being called a coward, but stupid? Hey, there's nothing stupid about running away from something that can kill you. The orange-haired woman matched his glare with a grin. "Nothing stupid? Should I not cross the street because a car might kill me? Should I not try a new food because I might be allergic to it? Should I not befriend anyone because they might secretly be a murderer? Should humans not have discovered fire because it could burn us to death?" As she ranted, the orange-haired woman's grin faded into a snarl. The sparkling mischief in her eyes morphed into rage, her voice becoming a shout. "Should we run away from the only person who knows what the fuck is going on because he's not exactly human? Should we stay in the dark, smothered by our own ignorant bullshit?" The orange-haired woman stared at Charlie, her hands balled into fists, waiting for an answer. Charlie didn't have one. "That's what I thought," she said, turning her back towards the bellhop, the rage fading from her face. "I have a few more questions." Charlie stood there watching the two converse. He wanted to run, but he didn't want to face the train alone either. "So, can we double die? Like how that monster turns people into those dried-out corpse-like things?" The bellhop stared at her for a moment. Then after a few seconds he shrugged, nodded, and held up his hand. tilting it from side to side. It was a yes that technically was not a yes. Although they were experiencing something that may function as a second death, it wasn't exactly dying either. The orange-haired woman nodded, then asked, "Are we stuck here? On this train?" The bellhop stared at her blankly for another few seconds. After a few moments, he pointed at Charlie and the orange-haired woman, shaking his head. The bellhop was bound to the train. The orange-haired woman frowned slightly. "Do you know what happens if we leave?" The bellhop shook his head and shrugged. "How do we get off this train?" The bellhop pointed at the doors leading to the next car. As Charlie listened to the orange-haired woman question the bellhop, he felt himself relax. The bellhop was passive and made no moves to harm them. He just answered their questions as best as he could. Yet, Charlie couldn't help but think of the thing that killed the brunette woman, how it grabbed her and turned her into a mummified corpse, its drawn-on face slowly forming eye sockets, and that ragged gash of a mouth, almost if it absorbed something from the act. Her essence, her soul, her life force? Charlie wasn't sure. All he knew was that it turned her into a corpse, just like the homeless person on the train car where the bellhop had been when they stepped onto the train. The orange-haired woman opened her mouth to ask another question, but Charlie interrupted her. "I've got a question," he meant to shout, but the words came out almost as a squeak. The orange-haired woman shrugged. "Go ahead." Charlie gulped, his grip tightening around his scarf. Can you kill? Double kill, I mean?" he asked. The bellhop turned to stare at Charlie for a long second. Then, slowly and slightly, he nodded. His face remained expressionless, but the motion had a slight quiver to it. Charlie felt his knees go weak, and he took another step back towards the next train car, his hand reaching to grab the door handle. It didn't matter that he would be by himself. He would be safe. He wouldn't remain with the bellhop any longer. "Do you kill?" the orange-haired woman asked quickly. Charlie froze. The bellhop shook his head quickly, almost violently. Charlie relaxed a little, but still turned around and flung the door open to the next train car. He was still running away, and he wasn't going to die, not a second time. He was going to move forward, through the trains, and then what? Charlie didn't know. He just stood there in the doorway, feeling the warm blast of air on his face. He didn't want to move forward to the next train car. He wanted to go home where things made sense, where he could rest easy at night, and where the dead quietly lay 6 feet under the ground. He had been happy up until the papaya disintegrated before his eyes. Dead or not, his life as he knew it was over. Charlie didn't want to think about it, didn't want to mourn what was lost, but he didn't want to make a move forward and away from it either. Charlie put his hand to his mouth and stared at the next door as it wobbled in the dark, shaking with the train, almost taunting him. "What are you waiting for?" the orange-haired woman said, her voice coming from only inches behind him. Charlie jumped, letting his hand fall away from his mouth. When he glanced behind him, he could see that the orange-haired woman and the bellhop had queued up behind him, waiting for him to move on so that they could too. Charlie sighed. He wasn't waiting, only wishing. Charlie stepped aside. "I'm not going to," he said, motioning for the others to go on without him. He didn't want to stay in the same train car as the bellhop. Besides, what was the point of moving on when all he wanted to do was already lost? The orange-haired woman shot him a glare. "Suit yourself," she said, moving to pull the next door open and stepping into the train car beyond. The bellhop didn't follow her immediately. Instead, he looked back at Charlie and shook his head violently, before pointing at the next train car, almost as if he was pleading for Charlie to move forward. Charlie frowned at the bellhop and sat down at the table. What was the point? Home wasn't forward. He heard the door shut, cutting off the inflow of the warm air from whatever lay beyond the train. And then he was alone and safe, for the moment. Then, the crushing weight of it all became apparent. Charlie stared at the void outside. He knew he was dead, but now the realization was truly sinking in. No more cozy apartments, no more wine and cheese night with friends, no more long talks with his parents, no more wandering around the halls of the museum, gazing upon artifacts from ages long past. This train, this silence, were all he truly had. Charlie covered his face with a scarf and began to sob into it. Charlie didn't know how long he spent crying, but he supposed it really didn't matter if he was dead. What mattered was that he was here, on this train, grieving the things he had lost, the things that were lost because of him. He was dead, the papyri was gone. There was nothing he could do to bring himself back to life. There was nothing he could do to reform the papyri from its disintegrated bits. The only thing he could do was either move forward or delude himself into thinking he could return things to the way they were. And as hard as he tried, Charlie couldn't force a delusion upon himself. He could not think about it. He stood up and followed the path of the orange-haired woman and the bellhop. The train cars Charlie traveled through continued to be strange. One had chairs made of moss. Another had floors that glowed brightly like the sun and were completely empty. He went through dozens of cars before he found another person. He found them in a train car whose floors were made out of pillows. The metal ceiling of the car was covered in star-shaped stickers that glowed in the dark. The person was sitting in one of the corners, hugging a pillow to her chest. She was an old woman, her eyes covered by the shadow of a sun hat. For a moment, Charlie wasn't sure how to react. Here there seemed to be another human being. Seemed to. The thing with the drawn-on face looked human at first, too. Eventually, Charlie raised a hand and waved at the woman. "Hello?" he shouted out. The woman lifted her head and faced him, and Charlie's breath caught in his throat. The woman had no eyes at all. Instead, skin covered the sockets where they used to be. Her nose was nothing more than a pair of slits. Only her mouth remained some semblance of normalcy. "I told you unless you're taking me back, I'm not going," she spat, hugging her pillow close to her chest. Charlie took a deep breath. He counted to 10, then he broke out into a sprint, running to the other end of the train and grabbing the door's handle and throwing the door open. The old woman didn't move, but she kept ranting, her voice hoarse and dry. Charlie opened the door to the next train car and stepped through, slamming it shut behind him, leaving the eyeless woman to continue ranting alone. He kept moving forward. Charlie didn't know how many train cars he had traveled through. It felt like hundreds, and their weirdness began to feel normal. The cars that resembled the normal subway cars were now the ones that made him stop and stare. Occasionally, Charlie would find a mummified corpse. He thought he would start to get used to the corpses like the weirdness of the train cars, but he found himself panicking every time he spotted one, averting his gaze as he sprinted past them. Eventually, Charlie reached the final car. He didn't know it was the last train car at first. It just seemed as strange as the rest. Pipes ran across its rusted ceiling and down its walls into the metal grating that made up the floors. Some of the pipes rattled as if something flowed through them, and a couple of them had dials with symbols Charlie didn't recognize. It wasn't until he saw the other end of the train car didn't have a door that he realized that it was the final car. Instead of a door, a control panel underneath a great domed window looked out into the void. And bent over the control panel was a person. Charlie froze, remembering the eyeless woman. He glanced around, searching for somewhere else that wasn't backwards. There was a door to the left of the person at the control panel, but that meant Charlie would have to get close to them. He was about to run around and retreat when the person turned around to reveal their face. They were the bellhop. Charlie stopped, froze this time out of surprise instead of fear. The bellhop's face was expressionless as usual, but they lifted a hand to give Charlie a thumbs up. Charlie relaxed. He thought he'd still be afraid of the bellhop, fearful of what he could do, but found himself feeling relieved to see someone who didn't want to kill him, and that wasn't a corpse. "Hi," Charlie said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The bellhop motioned for Charlie to come forward, glancing to the door at his left before turning back to the control panel. Not knowing what else to do, Charlie walked forward until he was a couple of feet behind the bellhop. Charlie peered over the bellhop's shoulder at the control panel. It looked as incomprehensible to him, with its strange symbols from a language not spoken or written on earth covering its keys. Little screens showed various lines and more arcane symbols, hinting at the information they gave, but nothing more, nothing less. The bellhop seemed to understand the symbols and pressed various buttons without hesitation. His eyes watched the screens. Charlie frowned, wondering who the bellhop was. Charlie didn't spend a lot of time wondering. Not even a minute later, a small light on the control panel started flashing purple, and the bellhop turned to face Charlie, his hand pointing to the door on his left. The door shuddered before slowly sliding open. Charlie gasped at the sight, dropping his scarf in surprise. The open door revealed not a dark void outside the train, but a landscape illuminated by a dim orange light of the soon-to-be rising sun. A worn dirt path wound its way between the grassy hills to a glittering cluster of little lights in the distance. The air that wafted into the train car smelled fresh and green, and for once Charlie found himself wanting to move forward, not because there was nothing else to do, but because he wanted to. After a moment of staring, he looked back at the bellhop and smiled. "Thanks," he said. The bellhop answered with another thumbs up, and as he did so, Charlie swore he could see the corners of the bellhop's lips twitch slightly as if he was attempting to smile. Charlie stepped through the doorway, leaving the train. To where he would go he did not know, but he wanted to find out.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.